Upjalasi, Gwe, bienvenue, welcome everyone. My name is Jill Van Horn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director here with Food for All New Brunswick. Today's event, for those of you that are here now, it's going to roll out mostly in English, but we do have really great interpretation here. Safia and Alfredo are interpreting for us today. And so if you would prefer to listen in French, you can just click on that small globe button down at the bottom of your screen. Alors, l'événement aujourd'hui, on se déroule principalement en anglais, mais des services d'interprétation sont disponibles. Si vous cliquez sur le bouton en bas de l'écran, ça regarde comme un petit globe, une petite planète. Et vous pouvez choisir votre langue préférée lors du partage. Safia et Alfredo seront nos interprètes aujourd'hui. And so, with that, maybe I'll give you all a moment to find your interpretation. And then I will dive in and start us off with a land acknowledgement today. So I'll begin by acknowledging that the land that I work and live on are the ancestral and unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq. I'm in what we now know as Moncton, New Brunswick. And the lands on which Food for All carries out its work is the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoq, and the Passamaquoddy nations. One thing that we've discussed at many of our team meetings and connection points is that, you know, the work that we do to stand in solidarity with First Nations, sovereignty, that it should not end with the land acknowledgement, that we need to take more action. And so in the spirit of pointing to current events and needs, I thought we could share something that we just posted in our recent newsletter that provides a really great outline on the Marshall decision. And the title is, After Nearly 25 Years, Mi'kmaq fishers are still fighting for rights. And so there's quotes and interviews with Mi'kmaq, Wolastoq, and Passamaquoddy leaders, both in what we now know as New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and Quebec as well. And so it's a really great overview of some of the issues that we still see today and that people are up against, and some potential for what needs to change and how we can help support that change. And so with that, I'll tell you all a little bit about Food for All New Brunswick. You may already know, but Food for All is a provincial food security organization. We work to inform, connect, and engage New Brunswickers in food security for all. And the way that we do this work, we have a few different things that we like to activate. So we host a food programs map on our website. It shows all the great food work that's happening around the province. We keep a resource directory up to date that points to tools and funding resources. There's so many toolkits out there to help support comprehensive food actions and community food actions. We host informational webinars like this one, as well as connection points and networking calls. And we administer the Community Food Mentor program. It's a train the trainer capacity building program to help develop the food leadership here in New Brunswick. And so we are also eager to connect with people in person. Again, we historically held a biennial conference, which most of our in-person stuff, including conference, have been on pause since COVID-19. But if you would like to stay up to date on all things Food for All, we also offer a bi-weekly newsletter on all things food and our work, with news and updates to support the development of comprehensive food actions and to support people's work and just knowing what's going on. And so I think Audrey will plop the link to our newsletter in the chat. As we get started here, I'm hearing all the little dings and bings and bells that are on all of my little devices. So I'm just trying to mute those as we go. So today, I'm so excited to welcome you all to our What If Exploring an Alternative Federal Budget for 2024. Just about on a yearly basis now for, I think, the past 3 years, we've hosted a bit of an update event on the state of household food insecurity, both abroad, like across Canada, and here in New Brunswick. And today we're putting a new spin on it. Our presenter, who I'll introduce in a moment, is here to walk us through some of those updates. So where are things now on the state of food insecurity in Canada and in New Brunswick? But he's also going to walk us through a really interesting tool, the Alternative Federal Budget, which is a beautiful document. It's a very large document, and it's a visionary document that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives spearheads. And it helps us see the potential if a federal budget invested directly in reductions on food security and in many, many other areas as well. Food security is just one of the sections of the AFB, I'll say. And so we'll be walking through some of those updates, where we're at, the potential for impact with an alternative federal budget. And we're also going to talk about some different policy tools. Our presenter will share some different approaches to getting momentum and mobilizing for action. And then, of course, we'll do a Q&A at the end. And so before we move into that, before I introduce our main presenter, I'm going to hand it over to Audrey so she can just share a few technical etiquette points.
Hi, everyone. So, we're probably all familiar by now with, these Zoom meetings and stuff, but I would like to invite everybody to just stay muted if you could, so to limit the background noise. And you're more than welcome to turn on your video. If we love seeing your faces. We are recording this event, but you will only be recorded if you unmute yourself, because it's just the speaker showing. And lastly, if you want to use the chat box to ask any questions you may have during the Q&A after, or at any point, we'll try to grab those and make sure they get seen. And yeah, so if you want to just abide by those rules, that would be great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Audrey. So now I will introduce the main event, Anthony Musiwa. Anthony has a PhD. He's a senior policy advisor in the Poverty Action Unit with Community Food Centres Canada, and a Banting postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Health Services Research, Evidence and Impact at McMaster University. And he's also a member of the Centre for Research on Children and Families at McGill University. Anthony locates his policy work, practice, research, and teaching primarily at the intersections of poverty, maternal and child healthcare, and child welfare. His work has received highly competitive awards, including the Doctoral Research Awards from the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, Société et Culture, and the International Development Research Center, and most recently, the prestigious Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Throughout his work, Anthony leverages his interdisciplinary training in social work, law, policy research, and development studies received in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Zimbabwe. So he knows a few things. And so, Anthony, with that, I'm gonna hand it right over to you. You can start sharing your slides. I will note to our other presenters, actually, so before I hand it over to you, Anthony, une note pour les participants qui utilisent nos services d'interprétation en français. Nous venons tout juste de recevoir les diapositives en français. Alors, ce que nous allons faire, nous allons les mettre dans le chat, puis vous pouvez suivre comme ça. Aussi, nous allons partager les diapositives après l'événement. Alors, nous les enverrons par courriel si besoin. So just a quick note that we will also be sharing these slides out to participants with the share back. So without further ado, Anthony, I'm going to hand it right over to you.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate the wonderful introduction. I have nothing to add or to subtract to that. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak to your partners, to your network, around an issue that's really central to Canadians, to the Community Food Centers Canada, to partners that participated in the Alternative Federal Budget, and personally to myself. So it's really an honor. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to meet everyone. As I go through the presentation, sharing bits and pieces of our experiences with this process, feel free to interject if you would like to interject, if you have an area that needs clarification. If you have a question and a burning question that cannot wait until the Q&A, please feel free to do that. Yeah, so without much further ado, let's dig right into it. So before we actually go into the nitty-gritties of the alternative federal budget, I just thought we could have like a bit of an overview about the food insecurity situation in our country, in our province, New Brunswick. So when we speak about food insecurity, it's also very important to understand what we're really talking about, because it really means different things to different people. But in the context of this presentation and in the context of the alternative federal budget that we collaborated on, we're really talking about a very specific issue of food access and food access and food availability and ability to afford the food, right? Like in terms of limitations in finances. So you might also be well aware, we think about food security as this broader phenomenon. When you think about the food summit, right, we talk about, availability of food at all times for all people. We think about availability, we think about access, stability, and all those things. But in the context of, at least in the context of this presentation in the alternative federal budget, we're really looking at the inadequacy or the inability to acquire food, right, on the basis of limited limited finances. And really, this issue is experienced differently across households, across individuals. So you might have individuals or households that, that have a bit of worry about when they're going to get their next batch of groceries, right? So maybe they're possibly living a paycheck to paycheck. Maybe, the paycheck takes them 3 weeks out of 4 weeks a month, and they really worry about when they're going to get their next paycheck in order to replenish their groceries. So we typically refer to that as marginal food insecurity. Then you have other individuals and families that might compromise on the quality or quantity of the food they eat. So, for example, instead of having the standard 3 meals a day, they might cut to maybe twice. And maybe they, in terms of the quality, maybe, the quality of greens have reduced, the quality of protein have reduced, because they are not able to afford that in a standard recommended way. And then you have other families that actually might be really severely constrained. So they might maybe, for example, go for days without actually eating. So they're really compromising on the quality or quantity of food, particularly in terms of the intake. So it means different things to different communities and different households. But when we combine these three categories together, that's what we really mean when we say food insecurity. And then we might have stats that really sort of break down each category to understand who's located where in the spectrum. So when you look at the stats in the Canadian context as overall, you actually see that we have experienced roughly close to 9% increase in food insecurity between 2018 and 2021. So 2021 will be the latest statistics. In other circles, you might hear 2021 being referred to 2022. It's one and the same thing. So at least 20%, nearly 20% of Canadians, right, are really struggling to afford food because of limited finances. And within that, you have 1.8 million children, right? So and 2/3 of those children are really within the moderate and severe food security sort of spectrum. So we are experiencing an increase rather than a stabilization or a reduction. And really, when you actually go back to stats, maybe for example, like 2010, 2011, 2012, we had actually lower stats than the 16.8% in 2018. So there has never been a point in the history of monitoring food insecurity in Canada that we have experienced a decline. Actually, we are expecting more substantive increases in the latest estimates that will be due in the coming year. So the same thing that also applies when you go to New Brunswick, right? When you come to the provincial context, right? It's the same story, right? Though with relatively higher than average numbers. So for example, we have experienced roughly 22% increase in food insecurity in New Brunswick between 2018 and 2021, right? Canadian wise, there was 9%. So you actually see that it's really higher than the national average, the Canadian average, and 1 in 4, right, experience food insecurity. So these are very harrowing experiences, especially considering no family, no individual deserves to experience food insecurity, especially in a country as rich as ours. So it's really a big issue in Canada in general and also in New Brunswick. And then when you break it down to different family types, what we are also seeing from the data is that female one-parent families and persons that that are single, whether they are living alone or they are living with roommates, they're actually experiencing disproportionately higher food insecurity rates than other types of families. And we'll explain that in a bit in terms of some of the key drivers to that. So when you have, for example, for female one-parent families, when you have, 45 is close to half, right? Is going towards half of families in New Brunswick that are female one-parent. That's really a cause for concern. For single adults as well, unattached or living with roommates, 28%, right? We also have couple families with children. It's really also like up there, really, at 25%. So these are, we would say, maybe 3, top family types that are really struggling to meet their food needs in New Brunswick. We don't really have data for male one-parent families, but that's not to say, they are not also experiencing that, right? They are also experiencing that. We just don't have reliable data to demonstrate the prevalence for male one-parent families. We also noticed that when you look at, what we typically call equity characteristics, right? Certain groups are, top right up there. And this is also not to say other groups that are like lower than those disproportionately affected, matter less. They also do matter. But when we see disproportionate impacts like this, we begin to wonder, we'll be interested in understanding why is that. So for example, when you see indigenous communities or indigenous families, nearly 40%, right, in New Brunswick, and this is a population. When you look at the the population composition, that will be roughly 5% of the total population, but they experience disproportionately high. That should raise red flags, right? The same would apply for within racialized communities. Here we actually, for the purposes of this presentation, I just bunched them together, but there are also disparities, right? Like within the racialized communities, you see, Black communities are really up there, like 3 times higher than the white counterparts. We also see, Arab communities also, really are experiencing challenges. Asian communities experiencing challenges. But on the overall, we see racialized communities also experiencing, and this also from a population perspective, population composition perspective, less than 4% of the total population. For Asian communities are roughly like 20% of the total population, but still, they also experience disproportionately high impacts, right? When you look at age as well, children are really up there. Just a few years ago, with children, it was also like very less, but we're beginning to see a rapid increase in food insecurity for children only, especially within the last two installments of food insecurity measurement. And obviously, children, survive or live within families. So families with children become also affected in that regard. We do not have data for other disproportionately impacted communities, such as people with disabilities. Post-secondary students are becoming increasingly impacted. The data is beginning to show that. We also have two LGBTQIA plus people or communities. But in terms of food insecurity monitoring in Canada, we haven't started being consistent and intentional in how we measure these different demographics, but they are also really affected. So we also need to approach food insecurity with that equity lens in mind. We also look at income. When you look at income types and who's likely to be affected by food insecurity. So most people that are working, right, that are relying on their wages, on their salaries, or even self-employment income, right, nearly 52%. Are really impacted. So we begin to wonder if the traditional stereotype of you have to meet your basic needs through the labor market is really worth it at this point, or is really sustainable at this point, right? When you have almost half, right, at least over half of food insecure households and individuals, actually working. So we begin to raise questions as well. We also see individuals and families that rely on government, transfers as well. When you look at, social assistance, when you look at employment insurance, when you look at, other social benefits, like, the guaranteed income supplement for seniors as well. These are also like really up there in terms of the proportion contribution of individuals and families that are experiencing food insecurity in Canada. Here on the graph here, I'm showing the national sort of picture, but proportions of the trends are more likely similar in New Brunswick. We just don't have the data, right? So we also need to be intentional in terms of how we analyze and collect data in order to inform our programs as well in the provincial context. But when we put everything together and start digging deeper, what food insecurity really means. What we see is that food insecurity is just a window to understanding household material circumstances. And really what we see is that households that are experiencing food insecurity also experience other material deprivations. People think about paying their rent before they can buy their food. So by the time they report being food insecure, they're already struggling on rent. We have, estimates that demonstrate that families and individuals that rely on social assistance pay at least 60% of their income on rent, right? So that means the 40% that's remaining is for food. But when you look at the total complement of the social assistance rates, it's not even adequate to meet their basic needs anyway. So that's a cause for concern, right? You also have, families or individuals that have health and healthcare, needs as well. They experience challenges with their affording their prescription medications and things like that, right? So when you break it down, we see that food insecurity is not just a food issue. It's not just a limitation of food, right, within the household. It's a whole other. It's a whole phenomenon that feeds into or that captures all these other things within the household. And people must really make decisions every day. Do I eat or do I pay my rent? Do I pay for transportation to go to work or do I eat? Those difficult decisions. And fairly, frankly speaking, in a country like ours, in a province like ours, we shouldn't be having individuals and people in households that make these difficult decisions on a daily basis. We also there's also an abundance of research that demonstrates correlations between food insecurity and health, right? Both at an individual level, household level and at a national level as well. Those that experience food insecurity are more likely to experience, physical and mental health issues. So when you think about dietary related conditions, diabetes, heart problems, things like that, anemia and things like that, there's an abundance of research demonstrating that, when you think about mental health issues, depression, right, stress, thinking about, when you're going to survive, how you're going to survive, how you're going to provide food for your children. And it's not just food as well, right? It's all these other deprivations that I mentioned. That takes a health toll on people experiencing food insecurity. And because of that, they're also more likely to interact with the healthcare system. And, more interactions with the healthcare system means more money going into, more money coming out of the house to pay for, for medications, for things like that. We have research that demonstrates that, food insecurity experiences are more likely correlated with, recurrent use of the healthcare system, of the emergency room visits, long-term care, and things like that. So I became acquainted with this study that followed up individuals and families over a 10-year lifespan. So, when they started, started taking like baseline measurements, those households, they didn't have, conditions like diabetes or heart problems and things like that. But after 10 years, they were more likely to report experiencing those conditions. And this is not to say it's just food insecurity only. There could be other extenuating factors, but definitely food insecurity will be a component of that. And that also contributes to, when we speak about higher rates of mortality, right, in terms of premature mortality. So premature mortality is, dying before the normal sort of life expectancy. For the Canadian context, that would be somewhere around 83, 85. Studies demonstrate that, experiencing food insecurity reduces, your likelihood of reaching life expectancy by at least 9 years, right? So, and this is really a cause for concern. And when you put all of these things together, right, that feeds into our public healthcare, spending as well, right? 70% of Canada's healthcare spending, public healthcare spending comes from taxes, right? So directly or indirectly, we are all paying for, for challenges related to food insecurity, right? When you look at like the disease burden, right, in the Canadian context, non-communicable diseases are really up there, and then food security is like number 2, right? So, and non-communicable diseases, cancers and stuff like that. But food insecurity, you deal with issues, heart problems, diabetes, and things like that. That really, takes a toll on our public expenditure for healthcare. So it moves from just being a food issue to a public health issue as well. So from against this context, this is where we were coming from when we, wanted to reimagine what we can do, what we could do with the food insecurity policy system in the Canadian context. So trying to think differently. So if you have time, maybe you have had time to go through the Alternative Federal Budget. If you haven't had time to do that, I encourage you to do that. There's a lot of inspiration in terms of ideas that are coming from communities, local communities, because the process is really from the ground up. Partners that, collaborate with, on the ground experiences to bring these issues to the policy tables. So this is a project, or this is an initiative that's led by the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. They have been doing this for like 24 years. And this is 2024, we had the opportunity to collaborate with other experts from about 50 plus organizations to re-envision and reimagine how we could address, not just food insecurity, but other challenges facing the Canadian context, right? So the Alternative Federal Budget has about 26 chapters, and food insecurity is just one of those chapters. how the process works is, the CCPA gets together experts in different thematic areas, and these organizations, they call them experts. We call them experts, but they're just representatives of organizations and communities that are experiencing real life issues like food insecurity, right? So they form clusters of working groups that tag team to develop ideas, to consult with their communities, with their partners, how we should address these things. So in this year for the AFB 2024, Community Food Centers Canada, which I have the privilege of representing today, we were asked to lead that working group for food insecurity. We had about 6 partners, 6 other organizations that are from different sectors. They have different expertises and different strengths. So we're feeding into each other. We had opportunities to conduct meetings and then go back and consult with our different stakeholders. If you are working with a network of, for example, from the CFCC, we have, a wide network of, roughly 400, partners who would fly, consultations in terms of how should we address food insecurity? What are you seeing? Things like that, and then we'll then come back together as a working group, and we develop something. And the CFCC was the leader for that. So ideally, we wanted to capture issues that are really affecting people. And when this happened, actually, it was like a run up to the right after the budget 2023 had been introduced. So there was a lot of frustration in terms of what people were really expecting to be there in budget 2023 that were not there. So some of these things I'll highlight in a bit. But there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of frustration as well in terms of what the federal government could do, and we took this alternative federal budget as an opportunity to represent those frustrations, those ideas, those great programs that can address food insecurity. So at the core of the approaches that I will mention in a bit was really tackling the root causes of food insecurity. Earlier on when we defined food insecurity, we were directly speaking to, income inadequacies. So it also follows logically that, we also need to think about food insecurity as an income, food security interventions as income supplementation interventions as well. Of course, that's not all there is to, but that's just, one key component to that. And when you look at the trends in terms of, how we think people should afford or should take care of, their basic needs, we think about work, right? We think about employment. But when you look at the trends over the last, 30 years or 40 years, the labor market, has grown increasingly precarious, right? So you see, the rise of the gig economy. We see the rise of part-time work. We see, increasing fewer protections, lower wages and things like that. That's what we mean when we talk about precarity. And of course, precarity is an inevitable component of any labor market, but the pace at which it has been growing over the years has been phenomenal and also worrying at the same time. And you also think about, when you think about productivity and wages, right? Like since the 1970s, like productivity in the Canadian context, economic productivity has increased somewhere around 21%, but wage increases have increased somewhere like 3.4%, right? It does not match, right? Of course, some people might argue, okay, all employers are paying paying benefits in other ways, but still, the take home shouldn't be 21% versus 3.4%. It doesn't add up. And then you also think about in liberal societies that are typically like capitalist liberal societies like Canada, the government has a responsibility to provide social safety nets, right? Especially for those that will be struggling to participate actively in the labor market. So, meet your basic needs in the labor market, but if that doesn't happen, the government has an obligation to to support you to do that. But we have not been seeing that happening, right? Well, it's been happening, but we think, there are definitely ways to improve that, particularly if we take into account labor market dynamics, where you see increasingly people not being able to participate in the labor market. The government should be able to chip in and support, right? So policies that actually enhance income have tremendous opportunity to effectively reduce food insecurity. And then you think about, earlier on I was speaking about different populations that are disproportionately affected, right? If you go to the root causes of that, right, think about, our very sad history around colonialism. We're not really proud of that, but we have an opportunity to address those colonial inequalities. When you think about our history with racism, we have different abilities to navigate our system. So when we approach our policies within that framework of a history of inequalities and inequities, we should be able to reimagine and re-envision policies that work. And really what this also comes down to when we think about our histories, also think about our cultures, right? So there are different ways of approaching food. There are different ways of approaching livelihoods, right? There are different ways of approaching work. There are different ways of approaching relationships, right? So how do we collaborate? How do we relate with each other? So it's important to think about how different cultures approach their food issues. So within indigenous communities, they already have their indigenous food systems, right? We should be able to have policies that reflect those, culture-specific systems. And that has not been happening. When you see the proliferation and outgrowth of neoliberal market-based policies that are really into appropriation, that are really into extraction and extractive industries and things like that, that really affects other culture-specific food systems. So these are the root causes. When you think about food insecurity, that's why we say it's not just about food, right? It's all about all these histories of inequities and policies that are not necessarily tailor-made to people's reality. So we need to invest in that. And how do we do that, right? So one of the key things that we were envisioning, this slide just demonstrates the sort of like 4 or 5 pillars that we thought would capture the broad diversity of the food insecurity issues that we're experiencing in terms of feedback from our communities. So I'll go through each one in detail. Number one, we're thinking about what if the government had a food insecurity target and what that target would look like. So when you think about a target, the federal government has been very consistent. There are definitely areas for improvement, of course, but it has been consistent in measuring food insecurity since like 2004, right? But we don't have targets for that. So when you don't have targets, right, you don't really know where you're going. You don't really know if you're making progress, right? That's why you have had, numbers that keep rising since 2010, 2011, up to present day, right? So how can we do better? We need to set a target to say enough is enough, right? And what does targets do? Targets, induce accountability, and with targets, we're able to invest, where you have what we call pressure points, right? Where you're most likely to have the most returns. You are able to target resources where they are most needed, right? And we have seen this happen with other population groups, right? The introduction of the guaranteed income supplement, the introduction of the Canada Child Benefit. These are well-targeted programs that also have targets. Remember, they're tailor-made towards the poverty reduction targets, right? Government committed to the poverty reduction targets by 2030. So we were thinking about what if we had something similar to that, but in terms of food insecurity. We could have, government committed to reducing food insecurity by 50% by 2030 and reducing severe food insecurity by at least 1/3, right, by 2026. And the reason we chose 2021 as our baseline level is we had just gotten the numbers, right, that I provided earlier. So, and these were the highest numbers that we had experienced so far. right? So maybe when we think about Alternative Federal Budget 2025, we'll be thinking about 2022 numbers because they're definitely going to be high. So the bar will keep on going higher, higher, higher. But that's the point of having targets. If we have a target, we have a commitment, we have accountability, we have resources targeted to where they are most needed, right? The other thing, we're then thinking about vehicles that will then help us meet those targets that I just mentioned. And by meeting targets, basically, addressing food insecurity. So we're thinking from an income perspective, we're thinking about at least 4 dimensions of income support. We have the guaranteed income supplement for our seniors. We have the Canada Child Benefit for families with children. Recently, we have the Canada Disability Benefit. When we developed the Alternative Federal Budget in June, July, the CDB had not yet passed. So we're still mobilized, excited, to push towards that. So thankfully that happened later on in the summer. And then currently we don't have anything for working aged people 18 to 64 that cannot fit in the other 2 pillars. For say for Canada Child Benefit is for children with families, but what about those without families? And then with the CDB, you have other individuals that do not have disability. So where do they fit, right? So if you're not a senior, obviously you also don't fit. So we also felt there was a gap in terms of the working aged people that do not fit the other programs that are there. So if the government was able to create something for that, we could call it with different names, right? You could call it the Canada Livable Income. Increasingly others are calling it the basic income, the guaranteed basic income. From the community food centers, we have something that we call the Canada Working Age Supplement. They are all different versions of the same program to address the needs of working aged people, right? So it is up to government to then decide which program best suits their fiscal capacity, their food needs of the rest of Canada. But these are different ideas that we then had. And we actually noted 2 things that we thought would underpin these different programs. So number one, the development of the CDB and the Canada Livable Income should be calibrated towards or modeled towards the guaranteed income supplement. And what does that mean? It means the CDB, the CCB, and the GIS, they're already indexed to inflation. So they're able to take account of the cost of living, right, and inflation as well. And they're also able to take account of poverty dynamics or poverty levels, right? So if we're able to develop programs that mirror those programs, they are not perfect, of course. They need to be recalibrated in some way, but they have been proven to work. So we need to build on that by focusing those in other populations. And then when you think about the GIS and the CCB themselves, when you think about recalibration, we think about, making sure that the resources invested in those programs target those that are at the very bottom, particularly those that are living in severe food insecurity or living in deep poverty, because that's where the most need is. So we need to think differently in terms of the phase-in and phase-out rates for these kinds of programs. And then we're also thinking about, approaching indigenous food insecurity from a food sovereignty perspective. Now that means different things to different people, but in the context of this program, we try to identify existing initiatives and then try to plug in where there were gaps. So, for example, we're thinking about creating a comprehensive indigenous food sovereignty program, and this program would involve governments at all levels, whether it's federal level, it's provincial level, municipal level, with indigenous communities, but it's First Nations, Métis, Inuit, right? And in different communities, it has to speak to different indigenous food needs, right? So we're thinking about what if we had a solid program that only speaks to indigenous food sovereignty, and that would have different dimensions. We would start with an indigenous food sovereignty framework for each community of indigenous peoples, right? How they envision addressing food insecurity in their own communities. And this is not necessarily reinventing the wheel. We know there's already work that's ongoing within indigenous communities. So for example, here when you have the Inuit, Tapiri, Kanatami, right, they already have a policy that's addressing food security from an indigenous food sovereignty perspective, right? So they need to be supported in that regard. But we have other communities that do not have these kinds of initiatives or programs in place. They also need to be supported in doing that. And these would actually go to the basics, right? For example, when you think about, Canada entered into nation-to-nation agreements, during the colonization of indigenous communities that were never respected, right? Like how do we work together on the land, on the seas, on the waters, how do we conserve, natural resources, respecting indigenous knowledge systems, things like that were never respected. So when you think about indigenous food insecurity, right, what we were also hearing from our partners was we need to go to those basics and start from there. Maybe how do we think about land reform, right? Land redistribution, we need to go back to those nation-to-nation agreements and re-envision food insecurity from that perspective. We were also thinking about, integrating, how do we integrate indigenous knowledge systems in Canadian federal laws around food and land systems, right? So what we have today, right, is thanks to indigenous communities that have been here for how many years, right? Thousands of years or millennia, right? They have conserved the lands, the seas, the waters, the air that we have in what we call Canada today. That must count for something, right? That's really relevant, but we don't really have that. Like earlier on, I was mentioning about, market-oriented conservation policies, right? That are really extractive. And you think about climate change and things like that, right? From a market-oriented perspective, it's not really working, right? When you come to indigenous communities, it's disrupting food systems there, right? It's disrupting, traditional methods of, getting food, hunting, harvesting, things like that. So if these laws were able to be part of the Canadian, federal laws around food and land systems, we should be able to make progress, right? Because that means, number one, we also have accountability, but we also have space to promote things that work, because these things have been working for millennia, right? So how do we think about those things and put them center stage to promote food insecurity from an indigenous food sovereignty perspective, right? Canada also has what they call the Local Food Infrastructure Fund. So this is a program, for those that are not familiar with this fund, that supports local food systems. So promoting food insecurity by supporting local food systems. So it could be, production, it could be, distribution, it could be storage, things like that. And it's really, focused on at a very community level. And we thought this was a really good initiative because it focuses at the very local level, right? But we also noticed that in terms of how, when you look at, PBO and how, funding is, utilized, right? There is a disparity, right? We have less than 5% or less, was it like 8 to 10% of the funding going to indigenous communities. And we thought, what if we doubled that, right? We can propose doubling the percentage that goes to indigenous food systems, right? And the amounts, obviously, they are not adequate, but it's a start, right? It's in terms of improving what's already there. And we also need to think about ways of, promoting indigenous-led reconciliation, healing, and trust building, right? Because when you think about food, our understanding within indigenous communities, it's not just food. There are spiritual dimensions to that, right? There are, psychosocial dimensions to that. And, it's a very comprehensive understanding when it comes to food. But that also needs to be led by indigenous people because we don't really know what that means, right? We also need to be educated. We also need to be aware. So how can we provide, how can we suggest, the federal government to provide spaces for that to lead in reconciliation, healing, and trust building approaches, right? Canada also has Nutrition North. It provides different programs. We know of the subsidy program. We know, there are different, there's funding for research around food insecurity, promoting, community food systems as well, different dimensions of those programs. But we also noticed that one of the key issues, particularly in the North, sustaining indigenous food systems is very difficult because it's also expensive. So, for example, when you think about hunting, which is indigenous food system, it's really difficult to balance that with having to work because it's unpaid, right? If it's paid, maybe the pays are also very low. So hunters also have to work, right? At the same time, that also takes the time away from their indigenous food systems, right? And it's not just hunting; it's all these other indigenous food systems as well. So what if we recalibrated Nutrition North Canada funding so that 40% goes towards those harvesting programs, those hunting, fishing, and gathering programs, right? That would also enable them to have culturally appropriate food, access to culturally nourishing food that's also deeply embedded in their spiritual lives, in their psychosocial lives, and things like that. So we also need to, we're suggesting recalibrating Nutrition North Canada in that regard. And when you look at funding that typically goes to NNC, it's very small, right? It's usually some less than $100 million a year. So we're thinking about what if we had, in addition to the $100 million a year, we commit another $500 million over 5 years, so that at least they'll get possibly $200 million a year, right? And the dollar figures can always be negotiated, but if we have a 40% benchmark that's going towards indigenous food systems, that would actually help, right, in terms of food insecurity. And then we go to Black-led food insecurity interventions. We're thinking about these three pillared approach. So we need to have a national action plan, right, that address food insecurity issues specific to Black communities. Right? We don't have that. And Black communities are also very diverse, just like indigenous communities. They're also very diverse, right? There are, diverse food systems as well. So what we need is to have a framework that speaks to those different culturally appropriate Black food systems. And that needs to be funded in order for that to happen as well, right? And once we have an approach in place, then we can have different priorities that are specified to address that. And then you think about from a research perspective, right? I mentioned, food systems and food approaches within Black communities that we don't even know, right? That address their, culture-specific needs. There also need to be research that goes towards that in documenting those interventions, right? Today, we talk about indigenous food insecurity and indigenous food sovereignty because there's literature for that, right? But we don't have a lot of literature around Black food sovereignty, for example. So there needs to also be research that goes towards that. With knowledge comes, evidence that can inform interventions and things like that. And then we also noticed that, we have a very good initiative, the Supporting Black Canadian Communities initiative within the Canadian context. So this, for those that are not familiar with this initiative, it supports organizations that are addressing anti-Black racism issues in different spaces. So it could be at the workplace, it could be in schools, it could be in the food space as well. So how do we, approach food in a Black inclusive way, for example? So there is also an objective within that initiative for new priorities, and we wanted to take advantage of that to say one of those priorities is food insecurity, right? Because, Black communities experience 3 times higher food insecurity than white counterparts. That's a cause for concern, yet they are only 4% of the total population, right? So in terms of new priorities, Black food insecurity should be should be one of those. So we wanted to think, we thought about suggesting what we called it a food insecurity add-on to that existing program, right? With dedicated funding for that for 2 years as a trial and error and see how that works. And that would go in terms of enhancing Black food systems. There are already organizations, you might be, aware that, a lot of, when you look at, Black Canadian history, a lot of social services have been provided by Black, organizations, with little to no funding from governments. They've been funding for them. So it could be social services organizations or churches and things like that. But we don't have knowledge around that. We don't have, promotion of those things. And those are the things that really matter to Black communities. So what if we put them center stage? They could really go a long way in addressing food insecurity, right? And then finally, we're thinking about children, right? We've been talking about children all this while and seeing the numbers coming up as high, is 1.8 million children. Probably, up to date, the number is already over 1.8 million children. And obviously children, within families. So that is a ripple effect. So, and we all know, right, Canada is the only country within the G7 countries that doesn't have this program. But we know the government has dedicated, has made a commitment to establishing one. So let's take advantage to push towards that, right? There's been really great work that's been going on in terms of advocating for this, for the past how many years. So we have to keep piling the pressure. So we thought that would be a good addition to reimagining food insecurity. Of course, when you think about food-based programs, especially within the school context, we don't really think about them as food insecurity reduction interventions, but they have other benefits, right? In terms of, allowing accessibility and inclusion within the school, especially if it's designed with a universal lens to it, health and wellness and food skills, these are really great skills that young kids can learn, right? But, it needs to also be complemented with these other different interventions that I mentioned. And we should, we're happy to, to see, there's a recent report, right, that came out like last month after consultations that showed overwhelming support for this program. So we hope, things will happen in the next budget. I'm going into the last phase of my presentation. I'm assuming I'm not seeing any individuals right now, so I'm assuming everybody's good. If you have questions, again, feel free to jump in, or you can still wait for the Q&A. But I wanted to share with you some of the ways we can continue to push these ideas, right? Because, with politics and policies, it's all about consistency, right? And commitment as well, right? We need to be consistent with message, and we need to be consistent with pushing to say, the things that are there, some of them are not working, some are working, but they need to be enhanced. But there are also other ideas that we can go about it. And, we have different levels of, of listening in terms of politicians, but consistency matters. So some of the tips that I'll share with you are from the perspective of the Community Food Centers Canada, not the Alternative Federal Budget, organizations that we collaborated with. I cannot speak to that. So I will share what we are really doing and how we can work together to push these ideas forward. We have what we call Good Food Organizations Network. It's a bunch of organizations that are really interested and really passionate in making the right to food a reality for all Canadians, right? So these organizations come together to learn, to share, to collaborate, to mobilize, to engage. And, there are also different tools that you can also receive, right? Like if you are one organization, right, you also have limitations. Maybe you don't have time to develop certain things or develop certain strategies or certain tools, but another organization has already done that. So this would be a platform, for organizations to come together and share those skills and those tools and those ideas as well. becoming a good food organization, obviously, there are certain expectations in terms of certain principles, how we advocate, we prioritize in community and systemic priorities. We meet people where they are at. We don't impose ideas. We allow them to co-create with us, to mobilize with us, to engage with us. And that's the spirit, right? In terms of, being culturally appropriate. We address systemic issues, when you think about colonial inequities, when you think about historical racism and things like that. We come together, we build together, we build, we mobilize, we engage. So that's one strategy that you could be involved with. The presentation will be shared with you. There are details at the bottom there, in terms of how you can learn more and who you can contact if you're really interested in that. We recently taking, the Good Food Organizations Network another level with what we are calling regional networks. So with Good Food Organizations, we didn't have a structure for an organizing structure along regional lines, if I should say. What we are seeing is food insecurity appears differently to different regions, right? So it might appear differently in the Atlantic region than in the prairies, right? Because there are different dynamics as well. So what if we organized, ourselves in a manner that speaks to local priorities or regional priorities? So that's how we, approaching, what we call regional networks. You might be familiar, some of you might be familiar with what we call regional champions. So these are like organizations that are actually leading the regional networks, right? They could be a good food organization or they could be a community food center. So there are 6 regional networks, that when they come together, they form a national movement speaking in one voice. So if you think about, for example, when you think about basic income, right? You think about coalition, we think about a national coalition, but there are also like different chapters that speaks to provinces and regions as well. So it's the same thing, right? It's more or less the same thing, but from a food insecurity perspective. So if you're really interested in knowing more, there are details there, how you can be engaged in campaigning for policies that work, that address the root causes of food insecurity. There's always opportunities to participate in advocacy campaigns. One of our recent campaigns was around the CDB, and we're really happy. It got passed in the summer, and now we are mobilizing for regulations that we're advocating for regulations that work. We're advocating for a premium that's adequate to addressing disability poverty, that speaks to the priorities and needs of people with disabilities, particularly as far as food insecurity is concerned. So, we partnered with Disability Without Poverty for a campaign. It was not in the summer only, it was like all year round, and it's still ongoing. We had opportunities to, to bombard the Minister of Finance with postcards that are demonstrating the same message, indicating the same priorities, coming from different angles, from coast to coast to coast. And that really works, right? Because, if Minister Chrystia Freeland is seeing, a bunch of postcards, on their table every day, it means it's speaking to local priorities. It's coming from different angles. There's value in speaking as an organization, but there's even better value in speaking as multiple organizations on the same issue. There are also opportunities to engage with your local MP. And really what we have also been learning, right, is, the disability CDB campaign really opened the doors to other priorities at a very local level. So, you contact your local MP wanting to talk about the CDB, but when they come to your organization or to your food bank or whatever, you're not just going to be talking about CDB, right? You'll be talking about housing, you'll be talking about employment insurance, unemployment, things like that. So that also provided a doorway to talk about other local priorities that are really challenging for people. So that's one example. You could also be involved. And then obviously encouraging or facilitating tax filing. So this is very important because as we all know, right, like in the Canadian context, our system is tax-based, right? So in order for you to get benefits, you have to file your taxes, right? There are no two ways about it, right? Like personally, I don't think they're going to dismantle this system for other alternative ways because it's been there since forever, right? Of course, there's advocates. We need to think differently, but trust me, for at least for the near future, this system is there to stay. So what we need to do is to meet people where they're at, right? Try to understand their challenges for not filing their taxes, because typically, what we also see from the research is that individuals and families that do not file taxes are the very same people that are also more likely to benefit from these different programs. So we need to understand their challenges in terms of why they are not filing taxes. Maybe they don't have access to, the system is really difficult for them to navigate, right? Maybe they don't trust the system to begin with. So what are the ways that we can do to demystify those myths in terms of encouraging them to file their taxes? If you file your taxes, you can actually get your money back, right? Maybe as an organization, you'll be interested in running a tax clinic. That's not an easy issue. That's not an easy activity. It's also very demanding, but where there's a will, there's a way. If you're really, even just knowing how to do that, right? If, maybe at some point you might want to run a clinic like that. That will also be an opportunity for you to know more about what we're doing at CFCC. And then obviously, that research, raise awareness, right? There's abundant literature out there. If there is, capacity is always a limited issue, especially with local organizations, we hear that a lot. But also, that's also the benefit of participating in networks and coalitions, right? Within that coalition, there's a research organization, there's a policy research organization, there's a think tank in that, right? They can provide those data for you without, you dedicating time and resources to doing that. Fortunately at the CFCC, we have a department that does that, right? That develops, that crunches these numbers, that, demystifies this, that humanizes these numbers for people. So participating in those coalitions can help. What politicians typically want to know is, to what extent, right? If a problem is, you're coming with a problem, to what extent, right? And how is it felt? Those two things. To what extent, how is it being felt, right? So qualitative and quantitative way. Without that, right, above all else, show the data, right? If you don't have the data, they're more likely to dismiss your case. So that's what I gotta say in terms of the different opportunities we have. But I know within the audience, within our partners, within our networks, there could be more really interested in also understanding what you're also doing in your different organizations as well. Otherwise, thank you for listening. I can give this floor back to Jill to coordinate the Q&A or the discussion or the plenary, whatever that is. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony. I see a hand clapping emoji or reaction. You can stop sharing your screen,
Okay.
and we can go back into sort of the full group. And you've given us so much to think about, Anthony, from where we need to place focus and the priority areas, priority communities, sort of that are disproportionately affected by food insecurity, and this idea of recalibrating. Thank you so much. Food for thought. We have a full room here, and I can't imagine that there aren't questions. I want to open the floor to anyone in the room that wants to throw a question to Anthony. You can feel free to unmute yourselves. You can put your question in the chat, but please go ahead and unmute yourselves if you'd like to just pose a question. And if there are no questions, we've got questions.
Go ahead. That's fine.
One thing I noticed is, the numbers that we have available to us are the 2021 numbers. Do those stats typically come out around the same time? I saw the published date of, I think it was May or something of 2023, that those 2021 numbers, is that pretty regular yearly? So we can expect 2022 numbers in May of 2024?
Yeah. Actually, this year's numbers were a little late, right? Like, because they came out like in May, June, thereabouts. They typically come out around February, March. So
Okay.
they were like a month or two late. So the next numbers, we should expect them around that same time. But also just an additional anecdote, on Tuesday, we also had additional data from StatsCan that also spoke to food insecurity. Is what I found particularly useful, right? The numbers are not so much different from the ones earlier, but the analysis in terms of above poverty and below poverty, there are numbers of food insecurity above the poverty line and food insecurity below the poverty line. It's really illuminating to see that whether you're above or below the poverty line, everybody's affected,
Right. Right.
So yeah, I encourage you to look into it.
I think there was just it wasn't the hunger count, it was Stats Canada. I did just we'll see if we can dig up the link to share that. I'll pause for a moment because I know if I'm speaking or if we're speaking, people may hesitate to ask their questions. So please feel free to unmute. I know you can be shy.
See, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Christine. So Rodrigo asks, what recommendations could you offer so that New Brunswick schools can prepare toward the policies that are being discussed at the federal, provincial level to address the school food programs?
All right. So I'm not really an expert in the food national school food program, but I will say this. Based on the discussions we've had, like with different partners in local communities, number one is to mention that the school food program, because messaging is always important, right? We need the school food program because it has its benefits for children and families, right? I spoke of health and wellness, skills, and things like that. Also encouraging, educational outcomes, educational attendance for everyone, regardless of background. That's really important, right? But we also need to clarify that should not replace, household food insecurity programs, right? Or come at the expense of those programs, because there's going to be a lot of money that will go into that, right? $1 billion a year prospectively, and that's from the federal government, right? There is encouragement to collaborate with provinces and indigenous school food specific programs that are run by indigenous communities and other private partners, private organizations that are already running those organizations. We need collaborations at different sectors. So there's a lot of money that will go into that, but that shouldn't be seen as for government to just relax and say, oh, we've done something right around food insecurity. What we really need is a multi-pronged approach, right? So key messaging is also important. Collaboration is also important. I'm not sure where the consultations what the next stage is, because they just released a report right after their consultations. So I'm not really sure what's the next stage in terms of developing that program. We'll see with the coming of the fall economic statement. If that doesn't happen, we also need to keep pushing. We need to make that happen in budget 2024. Yeah, so I think that's what I can say for that.
Thanks, Anthony. And maybe I'll add to that here in New Brunswick, there is an MP in Acadie Bathurst who's put forth the private members bill to develop the national framework for a national school food program. And Food for All has been in communication with some Department of Education consultants. So Rodrigo, keep an eye out on our communications. We hope to plan something that will give a little more understanding about what's happening here at a provincial level. And, you know, I'm looking at Christine Alain on the call, who in the Southeast New Brunswick region is also helping to bring stakeholders together. So in all of these regions, we have lots of little things going on. I also should mention that from the national perspective, we're hearing that the second reading, I think, of this private members bill may come in about April, where not the second reading, but a vote potentially may come in April of 2024. So there's lots of activity going on at that national level. Yeah. Another question for you, Anthony, from Wendy Keats. She says, thank you for the great presentation. And she's wondering what your center is doing, what Community Food Centers Canada is doing about putting that price tag on these ideas. So knowing that governments listen to dollars and not cents, haha, Wendy, S-E-N-S-E, cents. Are there any ideas to show how much these ideas cost and save taxpayers? And I think that's an interesting concept, right? Because we can't often see that, that economic value of reduced healthcare, perhaps, for instance. So what would you respond to that, to Wendy's question, Anthony?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, Wendy. Thanks for that. At CFCC, we have put a price tag on what we call the Canada Working Age Supplement. So we did some policy model simulation last year, and we released a report around that. So the Canada Working Age Supplement is really trying to transform the Canada Workers Benefit into a poverty reduction program. So the CWB is for workers, those attached to the labor market. And if you don't earn less than more than $3,000 or more, you're not getting anything. But we know that, you know, individuals and families that are more likely to experience food insecurity and poverty, many of them don't have any kind of working income, right? So if we want to transform that into a poverty reduction program, we need to target those families, and targeting those families would require transforming that program. That's an option. I've heard other organizations speak about transforming the GST, HST credit program. That's another tool. But for CFCC, what we have done is we've modeled that program for single adults, right? 18 to 64, no access to any other form of program, really relying on government transfers. So how much would that cost? Our model was, in total, it was about $7 billion. And we're thinking about $4,000 per single adult as a start, right? For the maximum amount, depending on income, it will then, you know the usual phase in, phase out, right? So, you know, you get less as your income increases. So 3,000 will be the benchmark for everyone, and then $1,000 will be an employment boost to allow you to get a job, to maintain a job, because you need transportation, you need working clothes, you need all these things. That would be a one-time, and that came up to about $7 billion. And then what we also then thought was that this was just a premium for only single adults, and we want to make sure it targets everyone between 18 to 64 who cannot access this child benefit or the CDB. So it's not single adults only. So we also need to think about that. We haven't put a price tag on everyone else, but for single adults, we thought it would cost about $7 billion. But the catch is that if we government might say $7 billion a year is too much, right? But what if we start off by just removing the eligibility criteria for $3,000, you know, $3,000 work income for CWB? Just remove that bar, right? You'll see a whole lot of people benefit from the existing program for far less than $7 billion. When we modeled that for single adults only, it was about $1 billion. If we remove the $3,000 working income criterion, it was about $1 billion. So roughly, if we're including everybody else, that would be less than $4 billion, give or take. So that's considerably less than $7 billion, right? So from a Canada Working Age Supplement, that's That's what we have managed to compute so far. But there could be other programs from other organizations. But what I particularly like in terms of these ideas, we call them different names, but they really mean the same thing, right? We call them Canada Livable Income. Others will call it Guaranteed Basic Income. They are essentially the same thing, right? It's just different way or different name. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for that. And so another few questions from our internal team, and I think one, a particular note where we're talking about the federal budget. When's the best time to influence federal budget decisions? And maybe some of the, some tactics. I know you've shared a number with us, but who do we talk to? What are some of those ideas that you might share?
I think the best time is all year round, right? The best time is always all year round, right? Because remember, I spoke about consistency, right? So if you're consistent with your messaging all year round, because you don't want to, because we see this happen all the time, right? Like 2 months before budget, comes out, because there'll be like consultations and stuff, right? And then this organization or maybe CFCC says, hey, we need this. And then, the policymakers will be like, who are you, right? Because you haven't created that relationship. You haven't created that consistency all year round. So you need to be active in the space, right? Whether you're talking to the media, whether you're writing, editorial pieces, whether you're connecting with government senior official policy staff, and being consistent with your messaging, right? So that's number one. And then number two, coming up with solutions, right? You don't want to go to government with a problem, right? Because there are also people like us, right? They don't have all the time in the world to create these solutions. The solutions really come from us. So, we're talking about number crunching here, about budgeting and stuff like that. Offer them an option, right? This is what you can do. We have done some of the work for you, right? So, and how can we help you? So it's basically approaching them in a, how can we help you, do your work better type of way, rather than you need to do this for us type of way, right? So if you're consistent all year round, we providing the solutions, the options, I think they'll be much more likely to listen.
Yeah, and it's such a good point that policymakers are people too. And, with the way that we have our government system set up, where we change those people's positions every 4 years, potentially, that's not a system that is set up for, it doesn't make it easy to have some of these long-term changes because these things take lots of time and lots of relationships.
Yeah. And also maybe just to add one anecdote, right? Like you said, what's the best time, right? I only mentioned consistency because, it's really important to be that. But obviously there are like these, strategic junctures that you can influence. So when you think about the fall economic statement that's coming probably next week, right? Maybe a month or two, right? You need to have started like ramping up your messaging, your coordination, your engagement. Budget 2024 comes in March or April, maybe in January. As soon as everybody comes back after the New Year's celebrations, you begin right away to mobilize, right? So thinking about those strategic junctures and then working backwards is also helpful, but also keep in mind they need to be consistent all year round.
That might be one of the habits of like highly successful people, I'm sure. Consistency is key. So I'm looking at time. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to offer space for maybe one more question before we share some of the final details for wrap up. Anyone want to unmute? Okay, so I have a question. Anthony, can we invite you back? Can we do more maybe local, deeper down action planning? Oh, I see some thumbs up from, I think Mario Duaron will be into that, which would be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so, Anthony, from my perspective, at Food for All, we try to make space for mobilizing. Would you be willing to come back and support some more local, like I'm putting you on the spot in a live setting as if you're going to say no.
Well, yeah, of course, of course. Well, I'm not gonna say no because that's the honest answer anyway, right? Like anything for food insecurity, anything for poverty reduction.
Mhm.
I'm available. You just need to let me know in advance, and we can make things happen.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
one last question, maybe before we share our links to our survey. One of our team members put some really great questions. We're not getting to all of them, but one of them is, what's one myth about food insecurity that really bugs you that you would like to dispel? I'm not giving you any preparation or time to think about this,
Well,
but
yeah, that's hard to choose because there are several
yeah.
myths around that, right? I would stick to, I would stick to meet your needs in the labor market, right? It's not working anymore, right? People are working, but they still can't afford, right? We have inflation happening all year round, and we have economic productivity increasing, but wages are not increasing. So this mantra of saying, get a job, right? Like pull yourself up with your bootstraps. There are no bootstraps to pull oneself up with, right? So that's a myth, right? It used to work maybe 60, 70 years ago, but it's not working anymore. So people really need support from the powers that be.
Thanks for that one. That's great. So we're at 2:28 and we're nearing the end of maybe our first What If event. I want to say a huge thank you, Anthony, for joining us and preparing a wonderful presentation and bringing us through some of that process and all of these beautiful ideas for making huge impacts on food insecurity. I want to send a big thank you to one of our funding partners, the Medivy Foundation, to Safia and Alfredo for interpreting, and of course to the Food for All team for pulling this all together. And last but not least, everyone who joined us today, thank you for being here. We appreciate you joining so much. What we're going to do now is we'll plop a link into the chat to fill out a survey. And so let us know what you thought about this event and what we can do in the future. And then as well, links for accessing all things Food for All are also there. Maybe last note, Maria Rodriguez says, blaming the market is also a myth. Policies tip the scale in one way and policy is needed to tip it the other way. So
Right.
sure.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anthony. Thanks so much to everyone here. And we'll look forward to bringing you back for something again in the future.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to it.
Thanks, Anthony. Bye, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much. Bye.